Hello, this is Peter Morrissey from the Stockbury Dark. Working closely with my co-host Klas from Stockholm, Sweden, we plan on bringing you truly dark stories from one side of the world to the other. We have been busy interviewing many of our friends from our world and subculture, stories dealing mainly with the occult, paranormal, and other dark topics. We really hope you enjoy these episodes as much as we do. What started as a spark from the mind of Klas has now certainly ignited a huge firestorm of stories that will surely keep you up at night. The Stockbury Dark can be found on iTunes Podcasts, on our Facebook page, the official Stockbury Dark, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as our website, thestockburydark.com. We can be reached at thestockburydark@gmail.com. Please help us spread the word, and thank you for listening. This episode of the Stockbury Dark is brought to you by the Black Market Kitchen. The Black Market Kitchen is a meal service providing you with delicious, healthy, and clean meals. Do you live a busy life and don't have the time to cook, or do you just prefer the convenience of having your meals prepared? With a range of options to suit many tastes and dietary preferences, Black Market Kitchen caters to a wide variety of folks. Perhaps you want to lose weight, eat less processed and packaged foods, and or just improve your overall health. At Black Market Kitchen, they have developed an understanding of the types of foods athletes and active individuals need to fuel their daily activities. They offer vegetarian, paleo, and ketogenic compliant options in addition to their regular clean meals. The gourmet menu, consisting of perfectly sized portions, is updated weekly, providing customers with something new and delicious each week. It is their mission to make achieving your nutrition goals easier. No matter what your sport or diet, Black Market Kitchen wants to help you become the best version of yourself. Streamline your life and order up your meals. Black Market Kitchen offers statewide door-to-door delivery in Connecticut for a $25 fee. If you're local to the greater Waterbury area, stop in and try a fresh juice, smoothie, protein shake, or bulletproof coffee, and grab a few meals from the cooler. They have tons of healthy snacks to choose from, including their house-made keto bars, as well as raw and vegan options as well. Visit their website at theblackmarketkitchen.com. Sign up for the mailing list and have the weekly menu delivered to your inbox. Follow them on Facebook and Instagram at the Black Market Kitchen. Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Stockbury Dark. My name is Peter Morrissey.
And I am Klas.
And today we will be talking with Klas, who is obviously the co-host of the show with myself, about one of his stories. Growing up in Sweden.
Yeah.
And the whole premise for the first two episodes was basically to get to know us, Klas and myself, before we go ahead and start with other interviews with the show. Today, go ahead.
Yeah, we feel kind of obligated to start off with stories that we carry with us, and it creates a form of mutual respect in a way. Maybe respect is the wrong word, but that's the way I see it. That we're going to sit here and talk with people that have similar experiences than we do, or they're going to talk about something completely different. But we feel an urge and a need to start off first with stuff that has happened in our lives and stuff that shaped us growing up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe obviously to get a little familiar with us as your hosts of the show. So, Klas, if you want to start from the beginning with your story, we can just let it go.
Yeah, it's hard to think about where to start because this is about my upbringing, or maybe I should say where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking about this today, yesterday too, about where to start and how to start, and to get you, Peter, but also other people, especially people in the US, on board on what it was like where I was born, or where I was raised, in between Stockholm and the old city of Uppsala. And I think one way to explain it is that now when you hear people, spiritual people, or even psychologists or historians talk about, I think priests too, they talk about how we have added layer after layer after layer after layer of technical stuff and social media and stuff that creates convenience and
Mm-hmm.
gadgets and cars. And that has made us kind of like, we're out of touch, and we've lost that connection to the soil or spirituality and
Yeah,
even history. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Yeah. So where I grew up, when I was a little boy, say if I was 9 or 10 years old, standing on our porch or standing in our backyard, looking, watching the local church or the village church in the horizon, far away. What I saw was what a boy would have seen 1,000 years earlier.
Right.
So all that stuff was there. I mean, for people that are from the U.S., Sweden is right up there. I mean, when it comes to technical stuff and infrastructure, it's basically the same thing. But I grew up in a very rural part of Sweden, in between Stockholm and Uppsala. It's funny because it's actually part of the Stockholm area code. And later on, when I went to high school, when we moved to a local suburb, and I went to high school in a suburb. But right where we were then, it was very rural and very old in many ways.
What's the actual town name that you grew up in?
Uh, it's right in between Stockholm and Uppsala, and the area is called Skepptuna. And there are different names. Skepp in Swedish is a ship.
Mm-hmm.
So from what I understand, the name goes back to the Viking Age, where when there wouldn't be enough water, they would put the boats on timber and roll them forward. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Yeah, like
Yes.
upstream or downstream. Compare Depending on the amount of water, they would sometimes have to roll them. I don't know if I don't. This is something that I've heard, but I can't swear it. That's what the name comes from. But it's an
Mm-hmm.
explanation that I got. And I know that you've asked me this before, about what it was like, and like the heaviness of where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also touched on stuff. You've asked me questions that touch on things that are weird to a degree. I mean,
Right.
for instance, one of the guys that introduced me to hard music, the guy that introduced me to Bathory when I was 9 or 10 years old, ended up killing himself in his early 20s. And the girl that I looked up to and thought was cute, she was maybe 10 years older than me, who lived by the village church. She ended up committing suicide too.
Geez. So these were people from your town.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Not even town, because like there were houses here and there. You know what I mean?
Right. So what
And
would that be considered? Like the is it was it still called a town or did it have another name?
I would I wouldn't call it a town by American
Right.
standards, but I would, if we
More of
have
a village,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah, absolutely. So when it was a village church, it was an actual village church, and then maybe 5 or 10 houses around it, and that was it.
I'm
Yeah,
just trying to get like a better
I know.
picture for myself and I guess for other people who are going to be listening of what you know
It was
it
very rural.
actually was.
Yeah, I
How far
think
from like Stockholm Center would that be?
like 45 minutes without
And when you
traffic.
say it's in between the city of Stockholm and Uppsala, is that
Yeah,
how you
yeah.
pronounce it? Now, what type of town was that? Is that a larger town?
Uppsala.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of American listeners might have heard about Uppsala, especially if they
Mm,
watched the show Vikings,
right.
because in Uppsala is where from what I understand, and I read a lot about these things, where the biggest heathen temple in all of Scandinavia,
Oh, wow.
or all in all of Northern Europe was.
So it's a very ancient
Oh
place.
yeah, yeah. As in by European standards, it's as Asian as it gets, especially
Right.
when it comes to Northern Europe. So this is where they killed man and beast and had sacrifices in the winter and in the spring
Hmm.
slash summer.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, sorry, I diverted you from your
No, it's a
your
good
story, but I
no.
wanted to.
It's a good question. Uppsala
Uh-huh.
is, I think, when I grew up, it was the fourth biggest city in all of Sweden. So
Oh, wow.
it's a pretty big city.
Yeah, I had no idea it was that
It's
large.
no, it's also a big university town.
Hmm.
So it's quite big, but nothing compared to Stockholm, though.
Hmm.
That's
So
for
where you
sure.
grew up in between, was that mostly like farmland and like
Absolutely farmland.
yeah.
So I would compare it to anywhere in the northeast coast, New England, or even like the Midwest. Maybe perhaps the fields weren't as big, but
Hmm.
uh, if you think about farmlands in the U.S., you could. This was very 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 similar.
Right.
Yeah. So when we get down to it, I always, that feeling of sitting in a business meeting or at a restaurant or in a classroom as a kid or as an adult, and you get that feeling that you're being watched by someone.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you look around only to find out that the feeling was actually true.
Hmm.
A colleague, teacher, maybe someone you don't even know is actually watching you and trying to get your attention. That's would you agree, Peter? That's a fucking strong feeling.
Yeah, there's nothing like it.
No, no,
I
it's almost as strong as hunger, I would say.
you know it's I feel like it's a very like almost like ancient internal like I don't even know the actual word for it, but something that you almost an extra sense, that we probably lost over the years.
Yes,
But something.
I feel that it often it starts in your spine, and
Hmm.
depending on the situation, it travels down to your stomach. It almost forces you to look around,
Yeah.
and it all that happens in just a couple of seconds.
Hmm.
Well, where I grew up, it shifted in intensity, but I had that feeling almost on a daily basis.
Wow. So
Being
starting
watched,
like from what age?
I wouldn't be able to tell you that, but I
Yeah.
would say, I mean, memories memories are weird because we end
Hmm.
up, especially at our age, we we have memories of memories. But this is something that I've carried for so long that I would say that, I don't know, 5 6 years old.
Yeah. So from a very young childhood
Yeah.
age. Well.
So basically, what happened was that my parents lived in Uppsala, where the heathen temple was. Not exactly where the heathen temple was, but
Hmm.
in the city of Uppsala. And that like we mentioned before, it's like an hour's drive north of Stockholm.
Right.
And both my parents were born in the second half of the 40s, post World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And they were the first generation of academics, with parents, my grandparents, all being heavy working class and shaped from manual labor. And what happened was that my mom graduated as an elementary teacher, and they started off working in Uppsala. And my dad actually worked as a teacher for a brief time, and then went back to working for this Swedish armed forces. But there's some cool stories in there, but maybe we'll get there another time.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom worked at various schools and eventually landed a steady position as an elementary teacher in Skepptuna, there where I grew up. And Uppsala comes in here again because over 1,000 years ago, this very area, Skepptuna, is where the water passage and the river led up to Old Uppsala from the Baltic Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And the Baltic Ocean, for those of you that are listening and don't know, is Sweden on one side and Finland and the Baltic states and eventually Russia on the other. And it was heavy trafficated back then, if we go back 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, because it was all water, and then eventually it became farmlands. So what I could imagine was that the soil was excellent for farming because there had been water there at some point. So there is even actually evidence in the form of a rune stone that in this area there have been Christian people since the 11th century. So it was populated from an early state.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned the village church. That is an actual church that I looked at quite a lot as a little boy because my nanny that I spent a lot of time with, she lived in a school building opposite of that church, and it was crazy. It was from the 13th century, they say, but maybe it was even older than that. I don't know. I think the church burnt at some point, so they had to restore it.
That's an old building. That's obviously a Christian church.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the cool thing about some of these super old churches here, but I believe also in Norway and maybe to a degree in Denmark, is that they will have traces of paganism in them.
Right.
One thing is that we know is that they would usually build churches where there had been places of worship. And
right. They would build right over those areas.
Yeah.
And that's happened in a
Yes.
lot of places.
Yeah, and what they would do here is that they would use asatru or pagan rune stones to build a foundation of the church, and then they would leave the Christian rune stone standing, which I, at the age of 37, have a bit of a problem with. But I mean, that's just history, and it happened to other peoples in other areas of the world. It's been ongoing. But anyway, the lady that I talked to you about that lived above us when we moved into the building opposite of the church. She watched me and my sister as my mom worked at a local school during the day, and my old man would drive through the farmlands into the suburbs and eventually Stockholm.
So when did your parents move from Uppsala to there? Were you born yet? Or?
They moved there in 1978, I think, or 1977, and they started building the house where I grew up in 1979. So my mom was pregnant with me as they were building the house.
Oh, okay.
And what happened was that with my mom being an elementary teacher, there's nothing super unique about that. But in Skepptuna back in the 70s, we were kind of odd birds there. Both my parents were university graduates, which was kind of rare. It was first and foremost farmer families. The local school had less than 100 kids. But teachers were hard to come by, and the local community was dead set on making my parents stay. So what they did was that they helped my mom and dad find a plot where we could build our house. And if you followed the village road after the church and after the little village, to your left there was a crop field, and to the right an enormous meadow for cows. And that stretched kilometer after kilometer. Think one of those spots that would make the perfect scenery for shooting a battle scene in a movie about the American Civil War. Yeah, it was exactly like that. But if you follow that road, if you followed it, eventually you would get to an area where the forest basically started. And if you looked really closely, there were steps there. 3 steps in stone leading up to something that wasn't there anymore. And those steps are probably there still. This is where my parents got a green light to build our house.
What do you think those steps were?
I don't know. I think they led up to a small house that had been there before. There were talk about an old woman and her son having lived exactly there, say 100 years earlier. But this story gets weirder, and it gets weirder now because we got a green light to build our house there, and my mom and dad were obviously super happy. To them, it was the perfect spot, close to school, and a chance to build something brand new from the bottom up. It was my parents' house, the house where my sister would live in, who is 3 years older than me, and also myself. But what we didn't know, but found out about in the years to come, was that 200 years earlier, I think it was 200 years earlier, this specific spot had been the location for one of those epidemic houses during times of deadly disease. I think you
On
had
the
those.
same,
Yeah.
so that was on the same plot of land where you were going to build your home.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, our land.
Oh boy.
A place where they took contaminated people, men, women, children, and kept them separated from the rest of the population.
It was quarantine house.
Yeah. In other words, they would let them die off there during grim circumstances.
Oh, that's Did they know that before they built the home?
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's not anything you really want to hear.
No. Perhaps it had been the place for such measures even longer. That the area actually, this specific spot, dates back for such measures, but without people today or people 100 years ago having much knowledge of it. But I mean, we know that waves of sickness swept the lands for century after century. The Black Death, if you go back to the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and tuberculosis and the Spanish flu. And in our yard growing up, when digging or exploring, I would find old bricks and bones and old traces of life. And that was
human bones?
I don't know. I found bones, and I would give them to my dad, and he would say, I'll hand this back to you, but he never did.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was a lot of things to uncover in that area.
Yeah, I think so. I know that they found a form of, do you guys call it like a talisman or talisman?
Talisman, yeah.
Yeah, from the Bronze Age. My dad found that.
Wow.
And we should have kept it, but I think he gave it to a local museum, which you're actually forced to do. You're forced to do that by law here, but
right. Do you remember? Did you see it?
Oh yeah, I remember it
well.
It
what was it of? Do you recall?
I think it was it was made out of some form of metal, but it had symbols on it, etc. It was absolutely fantastic. Uh, he found a lot of stuff like that. He found people reading about Nordic history now would a lot of people will start and finish at the Viking Age
Hmm.
because it's popular now, but there was an era before that called the Vendel Age
Ah.
when we had druids, and my dad out and about rambling, I think on a bicycle in the middle of the summer, he found a spot where in stone they had carved out small holes, and it looked so weird that he contacted a local uh, archaeologist who came there and spent a whole day there and said that it was a place where druids made sacrifice and human sacrifice to to their gods, to the gods that they had back then, which is
Wow.
absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's heavy.
Yeah,
There
that's
was,
very heavy.
yeah, it was fantastic growing up there. But like I said, there was also a heavy feeling of sadness. And like I said before, I had a strong feeling of being watched by something that I, at the time, didn't feel like me very much, or at least it didn't care for my presence.
I believe that. I mean, there seems to be like so much tragedy that happened in
So,
that area.
yeah, so much,
This,
a lot of tragedy and also a lot of history.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's funny how like those kind of feelings linger where a lot of dark things have happened. It's it's very common.
there was a lot of crazy stuff. Something that I've mentioned to you before was that at an early age, you asked me before when did you start to feel this, uh, and when did you start to feel being watched, etc. And I remember talking to my parents about something that I called the fog man, or the man in the fog, or the man in the mist, who lived out in the meadow close to our house. And 5 or 6 years old, my mom and dad have told me now that I even made up a song about the man in the field.
Really.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That I would, I could hum it, sing it to you right now, but I wouldn't. But it was, yeah, it was heavy, and
So this is something like almost like an apparition that you would see, or was it more of like a feeling?
I think it was something that I felt that I saw, and
Uh huh.
a shadow out in the field, especially during the time when it was fog or late at night, and the place was heavy, man. I mean, late
Was it
at
something
night,
you were afraid of, sort of
abs-
talk
abs-
over you?
absolutely. But
Yeah.
it was also a presence that I felt was always there.
Hmm.
And when you live with something over a long period of time, that feeling of being afraid goes away and it's replaced with something else. And I had nothing else to compare with. You know what I mean? But I know for a fact that in between our house there was a field that I'm describing now, and after that came the actual village where where the woman that took care of me during the day when my parents work lived, and that was an old school building that had been renovated where they lived, and that was opposite of the church. And when she moved, she had she was and is a fantastic woman. She's now getting up there in age, but the house that they lived in was, according to her, and actually according to the people that moved in after she had moved out, say 10 years ago, haunted to the point where they called in mediums and they called in
Wow.
priests too. Because when she moved out and the family moved in, that family claimed that it was fucking crazy.
Wow.
And
What
she
what kind
always,
of things would
uh,
happen then?
well, it kind of touches maybe on the man in the fog, because she always talked about this man that had lived in the house a long time ago that she referred to as Karlsson, which is weird because it's a common Swedish last name.
Mm-hmm.
But she always referred to him, to that or it, as a him or a he. And maybe that's who I saw in the fog. I don't know. I mean, that's just me thinking about it out loud now. But
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't seem too far off,
no,
if
no,
you had these sightings and feelings, and very close to that was this other home that was going through the same type of things,
yeah. We're also
It,
talking about a 5 minute walk.
yeah.
So there was in between our house and the village, there was the meadow, and if you would head up north, it would be forests that you could walk in for fucking days without reaching the end.
Mm-hmm.
You would might hit a road or something, but big forests. And it comes in here again, Peter, because there was something else too, and my grandmother experienced the same thing, and she called it varsel, or when speaking to you, I think it's the translation to English is pretty brilliant because to me it translates to the notice,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's a very accurate translation.
Vashil.
Yeah, varsel. So what it was that when I was a kid, but old enough to stay in the house by myself, what
Mm-hmm.
would happen was that my parents would drive home, drive up the road to our house, park the car, and shut down the engine. Get out of the car, walk in the gravel. Do you say gravel or gravel?
Gravel, yes.
Gravel, and they would chat, whistle, or even sing a song.
Mm-hmm.
Walk up the stairs to our main door, put the keys in the lock because I always locked it. Press down the handle, and then nothing would happen. Nothing and nothing, and I would stop what I was doing, walk down the stairs to greet them, but there wouldn't be there wouldn't be anyone there.
Wow.
It wasn't scary, but it was always weird. And then 10 or 20 or even 30 minutes later, the same thing would happen. The same thing would take place. Same sound in the gravel, same whistling or singing.
Mm-hmm.
But only this time, the lock would open and the door would open, and my parents would be
Oh,
home. And when I say the same singing and whistling, I'm talking about the same fucking song. Do you know what I mean?
wow.
Yeah.
So Vashil would be almost like it was making its presence known, but not really going too much further than that.
Before it actually happened, yes.
Yeah. Did anyone else in your family feel any of this, or see anything, or talk about it with you as a child?
I think my mom did.
Yeah.
But my mom did what moms do. She would be like, don't think about that, or don't worry about it. Don't.
Mm-hmm. Brushed it off.
Exactly. Because they also knew for a fact that I would have to be home for myself for 5 or 6 hours if they were working when I
How about
was.
your sister? Did she have any stories herself?
To a degree, yeah. She's 3 years
Yeah.
older than me, and she was really afraid of the dark growing up,
Mm-hmm.
like most kids are. But I think it had to do with our house. I think it had to do with our house.
Because they say a lot of time, especially the younger children are more open to these things, and are the ones that usually are seeing and feeling these before anybody else, because they're just more susceptible to like belief of it, I guess, maybe, or that the innocence of themselves, instead of
I think so.
as you get it.
I think so too. So we started off talking about how the modern man has added so many layers,
Mm-hmm.
so many layers to the daily life, and those layers weren't there where we grew up. If you add to that me and my sister and the other kids living in the area were young innocent minds, perhaps we were more open to things and to see things. I think
Did
so.
any Were there any other stories besides, outside of that area, especially with like kids, school age kids, some of your friends growing up?
There's a million stories. There's
Mm-hmm.
also stories of a church that's maybe a 20-minute drive from ours being haunted, and the old people in the area, in the village, said that the surrounding area of that church was absolutely haunted.
Mm-hmm.
There are also other things that took place in the area. You and I have also we have discussed before, if the surroundings, if the heaviness of the area, or the grim constant feeling had an effect on it. Now we're talking about unfortunately murders and more suicides, and like I've told you before, when I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, with my dad, without mentioning any names, I witnessed a man committing suicide maybe 2 minutes away from our house. And I'm not sitting here saying that, oh, the forests made him do it, or
Mm-hmm.
it was the impact or the surroundings that made him do it, or in other cases other people that also ended up taking their own lives. But maybe I'm saying that the surroundings didn't help. Does that make sense?
Yes. But I mean, it seems to me, especially after a lot of discussions we had, that there's like a concentrated like aura of dark in that area where a lot of, push people over the edge in a lot of levels. Does that seem right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
There's also, I'm a sucker for history, and so are you. And there's amazing places in the area. There's places that I will take you. If any of you listeners are familiar with my band Shipwrecked, maybe a 10-minute drive from my house and the village where the church is, the beautiful church, there is perhaps the most evil place that I've ever been to in my life, and
Mm-hmm.
it's an old ruin where we took the pictures for our last 7-inch, and
Mm-hmm.
that ruin is absolutely fantastic. It stretches back to the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, and before that even they claim that Viking warlord lived in the area. And for century after century, there has been sightings in the area before major catastrophes, or especially I think wars. Like if you go back a couple of hundred years, or if you would go to the First World War or the Second World War, local people have claimed to have seen a big black dog sitting and staring at them on the side of the road or out in the field, and it's like the
Mm-hmm.
dog is almost laughing at them, almost like laughing at the insanities of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So that place is also fantastic. There's a lot of stories like that. There's a lot of folklore in the area.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's the area in the world that carries the most runestones.
So when you say it's the most evil place, is that just a feeling you have
Yeah,
when you
absolutely.
go
Yeah,
there?
it's hard to explain, but I will take
Yeah,
you there one day. It's
yeah,
just it's just really heavy.
yeah.
When you go there, I mean, people like you and me, we will also find it extremely beautiful
Mm-hmm.
and majestic. But yeah, if you go there, it's by this lake. So in the wintertime, the lake will freeze, and you see the top of the rune fighting against the treetops, and on top of that, you will see hundreds of black crows singing in the wind. And
Wow.
I mean, it sounds like a poem, but that's what it is. That's what
And
it's
so
like.
what is the name of this place?
It's called Mörby Slottsruin, like the ruin of Mörby,
Mm-hmm.
which I
Is
kind of,
that is
which I
this like a national like park or anything like
no,
that?
no,
Or
nothing like that.
yeah.
And it's sad, and I'm not going to get all political about it, but it's like it's probably the same way in the U.S. People don't care anymore.
Mm-hmm.
People are not the regular. Your average Joe is not interested. Do you know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean?
Yeah. All too well.
But people like you and me care. So what I'm doing right now is that I'm kind of regretting telling you about it. Yeah, I'm gonna go back in this episode and erase the part where I say what it's called, so no one will go there besides me.
Keep it to yourself.
Yeah, but
So
all
I,
these things happened when I was. It was really intense when I was, say, the age of 4 or 5 till maybe I was the age of 10.
mhm.
And if we,
Yeah. So
yeah, sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
sorry to cut you off again. Getting back to when we were talking about what you call the fog man.
Yeah.
How did that progress any more? Um, with like sightings of that or any other types of like almost like hauntings in your actual home? Did any other things happen with that?
What happened was that what I described to you as the notice or varsel in Swedish, that increased and it became just more and more intense for maybe
Hmm.
2 or 3 years, where it went from happening maybe once a week to happening a couple of times per week.
Hmm.
And I remember this till this day was almost laughing at it at the end, and maybe that's my, even at that age, that's my dark sense of humor, that I thought it became almost funny, because it was super intense, and I remember telling my parents about it, and I was like, I heard Dad, I heard you sing this song 20 minutes ago, and I heard you park the car, and I thought you guys were home, but yeah, you came 20 minutes later. And my dad, being super rational, he would describe it as, well, it was, maybe you felt lonely, or maybe you thought that it was like damn, can't they get home now? But it was nothing like that. I mean, this is an age where you kind of enjoy being by yourself. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like being 9 or 10 or maybe 11 years old. Like that's when you do shit. You watch movies and you read comic books, or in my case, you listen to records. But yeah, it went down to the point where if it was snow, I would hear him walk in snow, or hear my mom walk in snow. And if my mom would whistle or my dad would whistle, it would be that exact same song.
That's what's really scary. How it
Yeah.
could mimic a voice or a noise from somebody else, and I would probably have a rough time with that, especially as a kid or as an adult.
And like it all crumbled down for me. I think I've told you this before, but the listeners have not heard it. If we fast forward, say, 10 years, I was in high school. Not 10 years from being 10, but from the age of 5 I was in high school. And our school was on the outskirts of Stockholm's northern suburbs, like I said. So kids that lived in the countryside where I lived would take the bus every day. And one day, I think I was 15 at the time, we did a field trip back back from the suburbs out to where we lived, to the older people's home that was actually also near a church.
Uh-huh.
And this was with all the kids that were from the same area as me, the surrounding areas, and it was a history day of sorts, where the idea was for us to interact with the old people that lived where we grew up, and for them to tell us stories about what it was like when they were little and lived in the same area. So basically, two worlds meeting and interacting in a way, which the 37-year-old me thinks is a really cool thing to do by the school or whichever teacher we had, that we would meet people from a different time and listen to their stories. And it was also really cool for of these old people to be down for it.
Hmm.
So we met at a home for the elderly, and it was cookies and cake with these old folks, perhaps 8 or 9 kids in my group, and an equal amount of old ladies and men. And we chatted about this and that, and one of the teachers that that was responsible for the day kept the conversation going. and he or she initiated this thing where us kids were supposed to say where we lived. Like she went from kid to kid in a circle, and then the old man or the woman would go, "Oh, Lunda," which was an actual area, a place in the area, and she would go like, Lunda was called Lunda Socken when we were kids, and there was a shoe fixer there and an old milkman that lived there, and blah blah blah. They would talk about what it was like when they were young. And Peter, eventually they got to me, and they asked where I came from, and I said, I'm from Sandhamra, west of the Skepptuna village. My father built the house there in 1979, and we were the first house there. And what happened then was that the room went silent, and I swear sheiks dropped on these old timers, and it felt like an eternity. And then it was an old lady that said, "Oh, you're the son of the family who built the house there. When we were small children, neither of us or our parents would take the route by your house. We avoided that area altogether and did not walk up into the forest there. As kids, we wouldn't even walk past the forest where your house stands. There are ghosts there, and Samramra was always haunted." And I went quiet, and I remember them and the table we were sitting at till this day. I felt like I had the carpet pulled out underneath me. It was, it was crazy because everything I had been feeling growing up, the presence and the notice and what I call the man in the fog, all that stuff just came over me. Yeah.
Became very real. So that's pretty shocking to hear. That people of that age were telling you that area was a haunted area. Did you ask them any questions?
I remember being almost angry, which may come off as weird, but I was like, because she was very serious when she said it, but she also said it with a bit of a smirk, like you're gonna, like in between the lines, telling me like, and you're gonna sleep in your house tonight. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I had it confirmed later with my nanny, who had been a saint, not telling me that was the case. That the specific spot where my dad built our house, where the house for the sick had been, was the place that everyone was afraid of. Yeah.
Wow. So it's almost like it was understood for all the old timers of that village to knowing that there was like a dark history to it all.
Absolutely.
You guys were like the new people from the city that moved there, and
I built a house there.
It sounds like something out of a movie scene.
I know.
Did you ever dig for like any more stories or answers afterwards, especially with some of the people that lived in that town growing up?
There's stories that are there and that are open, that take up so much of my time as it is. For instance, there's a rune stones nearby, and it's the rune stone was made by a brother of a fallen man, a man who had just passed, and it says, "This is for so and so," who in Sweden it would translate to "gäldade England 3 gånger," which in English would translate to "This is for my brother who taxed England 3 times."
Mm-hmm.
So he basically a man hundreds and hundreds of years ago that went to England to plunder 3 times. So I mean, if you know me, you know that stuff like that is stuff that I think a lot about. So like becoming one with history, or this is a cliche thing to say, but feeling the wings of history, there's so much stuff out there that my experiences with the dark had shadows thrown upon them, because with the ruins and the rune stones and the other history that's there, I eventually let that take up more of my time. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
And with the old lady telling me what she told me, I felt that the circle had been made. The circle was finished, and what I always had expected and always thought about had been semi-confirmed. Even though I did talk about it with my old nanny, but it had been confirmed in a way, something that I'd always felt. Yeah.
So eventually, I know you left that house.
Yeah, we left. We moved to the suburbs, if you will. Yeah.
And then the people who inhabit it now, have you ever spoke with them or returned to that home?
Actually, last weekend, doing what you and I are doing now, I drove out there and took pictures for all your listeners out there to get a feeling of what it looks like and what it was like for me growing up there. Because when I would stand out in the looking at the plains, that's what you're going to see on these images. It's actually what I saw back then in the 80s. But more importantly, it was what a boy saw, or a little girl, 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago. And that is really important for me, and for me personally, there's a lot of power in that. And even though it's grim, to me it's, and even with all the stuff that we've been talking about here tonight, it's the most it's the most beautiful thing in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's a fine line between like the darkness and like in beauty, what we consider beauty too, you know. And
yeah.
There's two worlds that operate there. It's I fully understand what you mean by that.
The area that I grew up in, and especially where our house was, and to a degree for me, till this day, I refer to it as my house. That place is haunted, and I suspect that there are different powers lurking there, if you will, or different powers that sometimes clash. And some of those powers didn't care for my presence, whereas others maybe they or it or whatever it was just wanted to play me a trick and like, hey little kid, don't forget that we're here too.
Right.
Yeah.
So once you left there and the family moved, do you feel like any of that ever went with you?
No.
Followed you?
No.
You never experienced any more feelings like of that?
No.
Since you were gone?
No, but I feel that it's there. So when we drove out there last weekend, it's there.
So it all returned to you, that dark, that heavy, heavy dark.
Yeah, absolutely. It's there. It's there. And if I would take you there tomorrow or this weekend, you would feel it too.
I hope to one day visit and be there with you together. I really would love to visit.
Yeah, we will. We will. This is one of many stories, and maybe fortunately or unfortunately, you and I carry a lot. Could you say that?
Yeah, this is going to be an untapped resource for both of us, I think.
I think so too.
And the more we talk and relate with other people on the show, it's just going to bring out so much more out of us. I know that for a fact. Thanks so much, Klas, for sharing that, because it's really cool to hear stories like this, especially across the ocean and into ancient Europe.
Yeah, the old country. The real old country.
Yep.
Yeah.
now that we finished our first two episodes, we're going to be really digging deep with a lot of similar stories, a lot of friends from all over the world. Can't wait to start getting into these next interviews.